In this lesson, we will learn about HTML forms. Forms are used to receive user input and then pass that data along to a server. Forms are typically one of the more interactive parts of a web page. So for example, if you visit a new website, the website may encourage you to create an account. And when you create that account, you will likely have to fill out a form. And that will include things perhaps like your first name, or your last name, or any other fields where you have to either input text or make a choice between different options. And there is usually some sort of submit button that finalizes your input and sends the data off to a server somewhere. Now, the entire concept of submitting and processing that data at a server level is completely outside the scope of this course. However, learning how to create the front-facing or front-end or user experience side of the forms is completely within the scope of this course. So in this lesson, we will review the HTML codes required to create a basic form where users can enter different data into different fields. And we're going to start from scratch. So we will write all of the code together. Let's get started. Here we are in a text editor with a new blank page. We can see the body element is completely empty. So if I view this page in a web browser, it is a perfectly empty page. So let's begin creating a form. The first element is very intuitively named, form. And within this element is where we include additional code to construct the actual form. So the first thing that we will do is create a very basic text input field. The element that we will use to achieve this is simply named input. And it has an attribute named type. And then we can include a value with this attribute to specify what type of input this is. So we will start with the most basic, text. So if I save and refresh in my web browser, we can see that we now have an input field. So if I click on this, I can then begin typing on my keyboard. However, it's probably not a good idea to begin typing anything if this field isn't labeled. So our users have no idea what is supposed to be entered into this field. So we as HTML authors need to label our inputs or label our fields. So there's an element named label which can do just that. Let's imagine that we, as the authors of this form, want our first input to receive user's first name. Well, within the label element, we can simply type first name, colon, and we need to go one step further. We need a way to associate this label with this input. So visually, if I save and refresh, we can see that in the web browser, the label is sitting next to the input. But we need a way from a code perspective to associate the label with the input. I should be able to click on the label and the web browser should automatically move my cursor to the field. So to achieve that, we can give the label element an attribute of 4. Now the value of this, we will type first name. Now this is a string that I just invented. It could have been anything, but we need to apply this same name as an ID for the input. So for example, on the input element, I will add an attribute of ID, and the value will be first name. It'll be the same exact string as we entered in the for attribute for the label. So now that these are matching, if I save and refresh in my web browser, and if I click or tap on the label for the field, my web browser knows to associate the label with the input, and it automatically moves my cursor into the field so I can begin typing. Practice makes perfect. So let's create a second field. So that means a second input label pair for last name. So in our code, we'll create a new input. It will also be of the text type, and we will create a label to be associated with this input, last name. Now we want to be sure to give this label element the for attribute. Again, this is a text string and we can invent anything we want as long as it doesn't have spaces in it. So I will type last name with a capital N for name, and then we want to include this matching string on the input element in the ID attribute, last name. So if I save and refresh, you can see we have a second field here, last name, and if I click on the label, it automatically moves the cursor so we can begin typing in the field. Now that we have successfully created two label input pairs, I want to point something out. While it's true that we do always want an input to have a label associated with it, there is more than one way to achieve that. So the first method that we saw is to use the for and ID attributes and to give them a matching name. However, an alternative way to associate the input with the label is to simply move the input to sit within the label element. So you can rely on your HTML structure to associate the two elements. So if I save and refresh and click on the first name label, you can see that we still have the behavior that moves our typing cursor into the field. However, even though nesting the input inside the label works in most web browsers, it still is not well suited for every screen reading device out there. So that means in terms of keeping our forms as accessible as possible, I still strongly recommend that you use the for and ID attributes to create your label input pairs. Having said that, I did want you to be aware of this label input nesting method. Moving on, let's add a submit button to the form that users can click or tap on to indicate that they have finished filling out the form. Down here, we will create an input and we will give it a type of submit. We will also add an attribute of value, and this is where we can control what the button should say. So we could have this say submit, or go, or save. Let's just start with submit. So if I save and refresh, we can see that there is a button that users can click or tap when they have completed filling out the form. Now, speaking of submitting the form, we mentioned earlier in the lesson that it's outside the scope of this course to do any of the processing of the data, like saving it to a database. That would require a programming language, which HTML is not. So HTML simply constructs the user experience, the user interface, the front end. However, there's one final attribute that we need to add to each of our inputs to make the form accessible to programming languages so they can actually do something useful with the data. And what we need to do is add an attribute of name to each of our inputs. So this is the input for the first name field. So I will give this a name of first name. You really don't want to include spaces in the name. So I'm going to have this all one word and just capitalize N for name. And our input for last name, we will do the same thing. We will give it an attribute of name. And then the value we will say is last name. We do not need to add a name attribute to our submit button. We only need to add the name attribute to input fields where users are making a choice or entering text. With our name attribute in place, our first basic form is complete. In our next lesson, we will learn that there is much more to forms than simple text input types. I'll see you in the next lesson.